Hi, I'm Jeff Gavett. I'm performing on the Resonant Bodies Festival Saturday, September 7th at 7 p.m. That's an easy mnemonic device. Just remember the sibilants. It's at Shapeshifter Lab in Brooklyn. I'm going to be presenting a program of pieces for solo voice and voice with electronics. No live electronics, but sort of a variety of different kinds of amplification or playback. The oldest piece on the program I'm doing is John Cage's Aria, which I'll be performing with Fontana Mix. A lot of Cage's older pieces, he specifically says, can be performed with other indeterminate pieces simultaneously, and then the title given as Piece A with Piece B. So I'll be performing Aria with Fontana Mix. And Fontana Mix is a piece of tape music that was composed using some of the same techniques and rules that Aria was composed. So while the pieces don't sound very similar at all, they come from sort of a common root, and so they can be performed together to great effect. The other electronics that I'll be using are a couple different pieces. There's Aaron Cassidy's Eye Purples, Spat Blood, Laugh of Beautiful Lips. That's a piece I've performed a lot for solo voice and laptop. And the software for the piece is a Max MSP patch. Max MSP being a piece of software that's often used for doing live electronics, actually transforming the sound of live performance. But in this case, the software serves to generate part of the score, essentially. The score is highly notated, the dynamics, the pitch, the rhythm, well, actually not the pitch, the dynamics and the rhythm and articulation and text are all very specifically notated, but in the score, the pitch is just given as a big empty staff with either horizontal or lines going in different directions that indicate either following or deviating from the audio component of the score. So this Max MSP patch, I'll put it in my voice range, and I'll put an earbud in and hit start, and the piece gives me a click track and a glissando that changes direction every measure, and you have to either follow it or deviate from it depending on the instructions in the score. The last piece I'm doing with electronics is Peter Ablinger's The Real as Imaginary, and that involves creating a recording of the text. The piece is just a spoken text, and I create a recording of myself speaking it, and then we smashed it together into what's called a noise sum. So if you imagine a sort of visual representation of sound like you see if you open up like an audio editor, you can see maybe the frequency. So higher is higher and lower is lower. If you imagine that, but then smashing it all together into one vertical axis. So it's every frequency that happens in my speaking of this text, but condensed into one moment. And then that one moment, which just sounds sort of like white noise, is spread out across the whole piece. And it's turned up loud enough that it would cover any sounds that I would make by speaking acoustically. So that's not very interesting, but the interesting part that comes next is that little windows are cut into that noise sum. So it's like a tiny little slice cut out of that noise that allows you to hear the acoustic speaking voice, but only those very specific frequencies at certain spots in the piece. So as we go through, you might only hear the fundamental pitch of my speaking voice, or you might only hear very high sibilant consonants like Saturday, September 7th, 7 p.m., which is when you should come hear the show. So it gives a kind of hallucinatory effect where you can see me speaking and you can see my mouth moving, and you can maybe get a sense of what some of the words are if you're a good lip reader, or depending on how big these windows are in between. But it's more about the sound of speech and emphasizing the sonic qualities of a text rather than its semantic qualities. So that's what I'm doing with electronics. I've got 3 other pieces on the program that don't involve electronics at all. One is by an English composer friend of mine, Martin Iddon. It's a very short piece called Pneuma Pistis that involves sort of gradual transitions between a lot of sounds. So glissando, so gradual transitions between pitches, and also a kind of gradual transition between different vowels throughout the piece, as well as a gradual closing of the mouth throughout the entire piece. So it's all about continuums and continuity and gradual change throughout. Beat Furer's Stimme allein is a larger piece that deals with some of the same issues. It deals with transitions between different consonant sounds specifically, sort of going between gradually over a measure, say going from a s sound to a f sound, so throughout it might go and if that weren't enough, there's sort of always another layer of something happening on top of it. So he creates a counterpoint within a single voice by juxtaposing maybe whispered sounds with spoken sounds, or sung sounds with whispered and spoken sounds, and different rhythmic strata interact with each other to create a true oral counterpoint. And he also sort of atomizes the text in a way that Cassidy does as well, breaking it apart into sounds rather than words, or individual letters in the German text by the author Büchner. So that's another affinity with the Ablinger, actually, is that it's a focus on the purely sonic quality of a text. And finally, I'm doing a piece called A General Interrupter to Ongoing Activity by Evan Johnson. That is the most intensely focused and detailed request that a score has ever given me as a solo performer, in that it breaks apart a text, much like these other works, but it also breaks apart the mechanism of the voice in the scoring of it. So there's a staff for the consonants, and there's a staff for the tongue with its tension or click sounds. There's a staff that indicates whether the vocal folds are engaged, so whether a sound is voiced or unvoiced, voice being like ah, unvoiced being like ah, or a consonant pair being voiced and unvoiced would be z and s. And then at the very bottom, we have pitches. So it's bringing together all these disparate elements that are running in different rhythmic patterns and different canons all together to create a really very focused but very quiet and very small, well, it's not a small range of sounds, it's an incredible range of sounds, but it's a very intimate piece for the voice, and it's about the voice. The composer calls it a study of the voice as an instrument that is uniquely capable of occluding itself. So like a brass instrument can put a mute in to change the sound, so it can stop up the bell in some way. But the voice is just the voice, and the tongue or the lips or the mouth, any of the articulators, are essentially a way of occluding the sort of fundamental generator of vocal sound, like the vocal folds. Or in some cases in this piece, the lips are a generator of sound, in that a lip whistle or a tongue and lip whistle. So it's a very intense but very focused solo piece for the voice that explores a lot of sounds that sort of happen accidentally or as a coincidence of all these different layers being performed together by one person. I guess I am drawn to a certain kind of complex score, in that I feel like there's a kind of paradox in interpretation that's come about in specifically, I mean, it's always been present, but I think it's even more present in 20th century and 21st century music, is that as scores become more and more detailed and more seemingly prescriptive in what the composer requests and what the performer needs to do, a kind of freedom opens up. Because if the demands placed on the performer are such that either the score is intentionally open and maybe vague as to the way it can be interpreted, or gives you a lot of options like Cage's Aria, where there are a number of different styles of singing that are to be employed, but you pick what they are, and you pick which color in the score means what style of singing, and you pick how long it is, and you pick what's high and low in the score. Whether it's very open like that, or whether it's extremely specific like Evan Johnson's piece, it involves the performer in a way that maybe earlier music doesn't allow for. Because with a Cage piece, I go through and make very detailed decisions about how I'm going to execute the piece, and a lot of them I do by chance operation as an homage to Cage's preferred method of working, and allowing interesting and beautiful things to happen that you wouldn't necessarily know to choose yourself. Or in the case of Evan Johnson or Aaron Cassidy's pieces, they're so complicated that even if you work on them and bring them to a point where you can realize the score, maybe 98% in rehearsal and practice, the second that you get up and are performing it in front of people and there's any kind of adrenaline or excitement, or you're in the middle of a program of performing other pieces, so your voice is feeling a little differently than it did when you last rehearsed it. The pieces are so detailed and there's so much on the page that whether you make a conscious choice to ignore or remove or delete some aspect of the instructions given to you, or whether you allow it to happen naturally in performance, and wherever your eye goes on the score, you might focus more on the consonants or the dynamics for the voice part or the very precise microtones, or you might focus more on getting the rhythm exactly right. Something is going to fall away, and some aspect of the piece is going to suffer or not be exactly as the ideal form that exists on the page. And I like that. I like that there's always the opportunity to do it again and to have it be different and have it be new. And also, in this age of everyone listening to more music than anyone has ever listened to music in the history of the world, probably, and everyone listening on headphones and probably not paying for their music, to perform a piece that can't really exist in a definitive recorded version means that it's more focused on the live and the human aspect of performance, and that if someone comes to hear me sing this Cassidy piece, that's the only time they'll ever hear that. That's the only time they'll ever hear this version of this piece. Now they could, I could send them a recording of that performance if they wanted a recording of it, but seeing the physical body of the person performing something that will only ever happen this one time, that even if I wanted to, I can't do it exactly the same the next time. And with the Cassidy piece especially, the glissando that you get in your ear, even if you put in the same voice range the next time that you go through, it'll be slightly different. And it goes sort of by some random parameters, so you can never actually even practice it exactly. And I kind of love that idea that I'm in love with failure in a certain way, that it allows for going on with your life. As if it's I was just reading for the second time Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, and a lot of it is focused on the lives of these young sort of future tennis pros, but prepubescent boys who are at like the height of competitive talent and physical conditioning, and part of the idea of the book is that you have this motivation to become the best or to achieve this one great thing in your life from such a young age as a competitive athlete. And what happens when you get it? He talks about as the carrot problem, that, you know, the carrot and the stick of motivation and punishment. But what happens when you get the carrot? Then what do you do? And I think part of what attracts me to these, I mean, maybe you could say impossible or just extraordinarily difficult scores, is that there's always a carrot, because I'm never gonna get it totally right. You can always come back and find a new thing. I think that's there's a Donald Barthelme short story called, I forget exactly what it's called, but it's about nothing, and the notion of the story is that the narrator is going to define all the things that are not nothing. So it's sort of a list of any number of disconnected and disparate things, and he sort of muses on the idea of this task at the end, that how wonderful a notion that, I'm paraphrasing, that we will always fail, and that this failure can be present for us. The task will always be before us like a meaning for our lives. And I think that's a great positive notion of what failure can mean artistically. It's not that I'm not striving to perform these as exactly as I can and working harder on these kinds of scores than I work on anything else, but that the inevitable outcome will be just like a better kind of failure than the last time. And that's the ideal, I think. Fail better. I think being a composer influences the way I work, in that I'm very analytically minded when I look at a score, and that in addition to wondering how I'm going to do it, and actually supporting how I'm going to do it, is that I tend to sort of take it apart as I look at and try and imagine how the composer put it together, and what's, you know, what the composer wanted, and how the composer came up with the ideas and this structure, and what it's, you know, what the composer's stated intentions are, if there are notes or if I've talked to the composer, and what the sort of apparent results are from the score, and whether those differ. And I've even, you know, I'm sort of a natural proofreader when it comes to new scores, in that I'll look very closely at the details of how something's put together to try and get a closer grasp on how to learn it. So I'll pick out, like, should there be a dot on this eighth note? Is this supposed to be an E flat or an E? Like, so I think being a composer makes me look at scores that way, and I agree that there's something less satisfying about performing older music sometimes. I think it goes back to the role of the interpreter, like I was talking about before. Like, I have an idea that I think I got from my undergraduate education in classical singing and in opera, that if you want to know how to do something that, you know, has a long tradition and a lot of standard things that you need to know to add in on top of the score, which is true in opera especially, that there are things that you do that aren't in the score, that are because someone else did this thing and it worked really well. So you need to go and listen to a bunch of recordings of people singing this thing. And, you know, if you're singing especially late traditional repertoire, maybe there's a recording of someone who premiered it. But I remember thinking very distinctly as an undergraduate, when I was singing some Italian operatic repertoire, I listened to some very, very old recordings, some of the earliest sound recordings of opera, of these Italian baritones singing this repertoire. And I thought, Jesus, they sound really good on this. Like, this is this sounds Italian. This sounds like someone of this time, someone who understands the language and the idiom as like a part of their life and a part of their being. And I thought, what the hell can I do with this? The 19th century Italian didn't already do better. And that, I think that's what drove me from standard repertoire for a while, is the idea that, like, what can I do for this? Like, there's no, I mean, I love the music still, but I felt like there's no specific reason that I need to be singing it. Like, there's nothing that I can bring to it that's, you know, as a 21st century American can bring to it that's going to be some sort of either authentic or interestingly novel take on Rossini. My musical history starts off with my grandmother, my dad's mother. There's really nobody in my extended family is much of a musician at all, except my dad's mom. And when I was a little kid, they would take me over to her house, and I would just sit on her lap and pound on her piano. And she would say, "He's musical. He's got talent. He's musical," she says of the 2-year-old bashing the piano. And she died when I was 6 and willed her piano to me. So she sort of gave me this, you know, this incredible gift that's become my whole life by giving me a piano as a 6-year-old, rather than giving it to any of her 8 sons and daughters or any of their kids, you know, grown people who may have had more immediate use for it. So I started taking piano lessons. I took those for maybe 2 or 3 years, and I eventually quit my piano lessons after feeling like my piano teacher was a mean old lady. Specifically, I remember distinctly that I had started to sort of work some things out by ear at the piano. I really liked extemporaneously playing at the piano, even when I had no idea what I was doing, just sort of playing or figuring things out by ear. And I figured out the theme to The Simpsons, or at least some part of it. I remember thinking, looking back on it, that's pretty good. I got some sort of Lydian thing I figured out as a little kid. And I remember I was very proud, and I brought it to my teacher, and I said, "Here's this thing that I figured out." And she yelled at me for playing it because The Simpsons was an amoral show, rather than praising this child who had, you know, sort of tried to do something creative on his own. So I quit piano lessons, and I traded some magic cards for a crappy electric guitar, and started my sort of vernacular pop music career. And I learned to play guitar and sing in, you know, pop style. And I guess I started a band when I was in 8th grade, like a cover band. We played like Bare Naked Ladies and Green Day and Foo Fighters. And we eventually recorded an album of original stuff, but that wasn't for several years later until like 16 or 17 that I actually started writing original songs. But around that same time, I started singing the chorus at school and, you know, being in musicals at school. And that was sort of my intro into classical music again. And I taught myself to read music again. I had forgotten from playing piano. I taught myself to read again and play piano again. And I remember in our sort of select course at school, we're getting ready for the all-state auditions, the big, you know, the big to-do every year, who's going to get into the all-state choir. In Maine, there's only like 1.5 million people, so, you know, a lot of us are going to get in. But we were singing Già il sole dal Gange from the Dirty Double Dozen, the Italian songs and arias. And I remember we were all sort of singing for one another in this class. And one of the other kids, this other great baritone, really natural voice, who ended up going to St. Olaf, and I went to Westminster Choir College, he sang it, and someone else in the class said, "Wow, Sean, you should be an opera singer." And I remember feeling this like intense envy at that moment, like, wait, why am I envious that someone said that to him? Like, I guess I sort of want to be a classical singer. I guess that's what I want to do. And it's so funny that the like impetus for going into this lofty field of artistic pursuit or whatever. The initial moment of it was just this gross envy. So I went to Westminster Choir College for undergraduate, and I started composing a little more seriously when I was there. I had a great theory and composition teacher who was a Nadia Boulanger student, and who was this very rigorous but very kind, unlike the reputation of his teacher who just encouraged me to explore different sort of historical periods and styles of composing. And I sort of composed on and off all throughout undergrad, and got more seriously into it when I went to the contemporary program at Manhattan School of Music, and started writing a lot more when I formed Load Bang, which is my group with trumpet, trombone, bass, clarinet, and me. Started writing for that group because we had no repertoire, so we needed to write for the group, or improvise, as we did a lot, and we still do some. And I guess my other main musical pursuit, other than Load Bang, where we've commissioned, I think, maybe 60 or 70 pieces for Load Bang over the years, including a lot of residencies at schools. My other main project is Ekmeles. It's a vocal ensemble that I started in the fall of 2010 that mainly performs new music. We've done a couple older pieces, but usually with a contemporary spin, like we did this Gesualdo in a sort of hypothetical, historically accurate tuning. I had been interested in different tunings and temperaments, and had read that Scipione Stella, I believe is the composer's name, he was a court composer who was in Gesualdo's court. And he had replicas of Vicentino, a composer of an earlier generation, had replicas of his instruments built. And he had built 31-note harpsichords and organs to create this, essentially a mean tone instrument that could modulate as far out as you wanted into double sharps and double flats, but still stay in tune in mean tone tuning. Whereas normally if you were tuned to C and you went out to F sharp or something in mean tone tuning, it would sound pretty bad. So Vicentino created this way of being in tune way far out. And then Stella had instruments built as replicas, and those were in the inventory of Gesualdo's castle, I think, in his will or something. So I thought, well, Gesualdo writes this music that modulates really far and has these weird enharmonic switches, like there'll be a D-flat major chord and then there'll be an A major chord. So technically D-flat is the same note if you're thinking equal tempered, but I mean, why would he write D-flat and then C-sharp if he didn't mean there were different notes? So we performed Gesualdo in this temperament where there aren't those enharmonic equivalencies. But normally we perform contemporary music, done a lot of commissioning. We're working a lot in microtonal music, specifically just intonation music. Music that's the intervals, rather than being the intervals on the piano, which are octaves cut into equal slices, just intonation is about pure intervals of various small number frequency ratios, so intervals tunable by ear. And I've been teaching a microtonal ear training course recently, and thanks to Lucy for helping me get this off the ground and encouraging me to teach that class, actually, where we've been working on exploring different just intonation tuning systems sort of systematically. And it's been really useful for me too to have to articulate and systematize something that up till now I've just been doing as sort of, something I was just interested in and something that I just dug into because I found it fascinating. It's really exciting, and it's great to be able to be a part of something new happening in the city and something that just showcases the breadth of what it means to be a singer of new music. I feel like there's such a variety of what people's real passions are and what their own what's central in their musical lives that you wouldn't necessarily know from seeing someone, out gigging, even if they're out gigging doing something extremely interesting or something new or exciting. To see all the different influences that go into what make all these singers so interesting it's going to be a really great festival, and I would be there even if I weren't singing it.